I haven't done a rod building related video in quite a while. I've been pretty busy. As most of you know, I have been making these new rod building jigs. Since I was selling these directly through my Shopify store, I expected sales to be lower than what they were on eBay because you're not reaching as big of an audience. It's really just the people that are watching my YouTube stuff that are seeing these, but people are really buying them. So I've been really busy trying to keep up with that, and I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that's why I haven't done a whole lot of videos, because I still like to try to show people different things, different ways of doing things. I had something that I wanted to make a reference stick for. A reference stick would be showing different color combinations, and I can just use this stick as a reference for seeing what these colors look like on a rod with epoxy on it. What I was wanting to make a reference stick for is to show the color differences using different type of metallic under wraps, doing candy apple wraps. And I've never done candy apple wraps. I've read about them for years, but people have started posting some of their stuff online on Facebook that I've been noticing here lately. It looks good. It looks really good. What a candy apple wrap is that you take a base thread that's a metallic thread, and in this case I'm using silver, gold, and a copper colored metallic thread. You do a wrap with the metallic thread, and then you go over it with a thread that is not color protected, and you don't use color protectant on the thread. The idea here is you want the thread to go semi-translucent, and it will pick up some of the effects of the metallic thread underneath. And what I found was that the color matches are almost identical on most of the colors using the silver metallic as the base wrap. The whites look outstanding using the silver, and you'll see some different combinations as I go along. I'll point out some of the things that I noticed. The thread actually darkens less using this technique than it does if you use a color preserver on top of thread, which I thought was really interesting, especially if you're using the silver under wraps. But I just want to go through some of this and show you and give you some ideas that you might be able to use for yourself and incorporate into your own projects. I really like some of the color changes you get based on the under wrap. The darker the under wrap, the darker the final product is, and that could be a handy thing to keep in your toolbox for use at some point if you need a slightly darker thread color than what you've got on the spool itself. I started making the reference stick by making the metallic wraps first, and then I went back and added 12 different colors. I wasn't being particularly careful about how I wrapped this. I was kind of going for a worst case scenario situation where I left a few gaps along the way just to see what things look like, to see how the metallic thread would shine through in the spots where you might have left a little bit of a gap. It would definitely look better, I think, if you did these and you actually laid down a metallic wrap and did a thin coat of epoxy over that, and then went back and wrapped over the top of it. It'd make it a lot easier to pack your threads in and stuff. I found that when I did try to pack the threads, I was able to do it directly on top of the metallic wrap, but since the two threads were a similar size, it was a little bit more difficult. Now, if you did a smaller diameter under wrap and then wrapped over the top of that with a larger diameter, just say you go from A on the metallic to D on your wrap that's going on your guides as your final thread that you want showing on top, that would be a lot easier to pack your threads that way. But if you're using the same size thread, it would probably be easiest for most people to put a thin layer of epoxy over the top of the metallic wrap and then go back over that with the same size thread. You can do it without doing that. It's just a little more cumbersome. But like I said, I wasn't being really careful with my wraps, and I was trying out a new type of epoxy. I've never used Gen 4. I know it's a hit with pretty much everybody. I used Gen 4 on this, and I did some experimentation with the epoxy as I was doing this. I was being sloppy with it intentionally. I torture tested it, tried to mess it up a few different ways, and I got really good results with it regardless. I didn't get it level. I didn't intend to try to get it level. If I wanted to do that, it would have been no problem, but I was doing weird things with it just to see what it could take and what it didn't like. I was using heat in spots, not heat in other spots. I tried to get it to bubble up a little bit from an excessive amount of heat, and I did get some micro bubbles from that. I tried to wipe off a section with some acetone to see how it would react to that. Just things that people do as they're building rods occasionally, just to see how the epoxy reacted. And it held up really well, and it doesn't look awful. I mean, it's not flat, but it doesn't look awful despite my attempts to mess it up. So I'd say that's a pretty good sign that it's fairly easy to work with. This was all done at room temperature, and that helps a whole lot, is having a controlled environment to do your epoxy in. I don't attempt to put epoxy on when it's colder than it should be or anything like that. I try to follow just a good basic common sense type thing. It's best to do it in a temperature controlled environment where your temperatures aren't too low or too high, so that it's not either too thick or too runny. It's just kind of a nice consistency to work with at room temperature. If I wanted to do a good job on this, I have no doubt it would have been easy to do with this epoxy. It didn't give me any kind of troubles of any sort, and in fact it held up better than I thought it would when I was trying to mess it up. So that's definitely a good thing. I think I'll like using this epoxy. And there's a rod builder I know through Facebook that did an experiment where he left several different types of epoxy outside in the weather in direct sunlight for several days, weeks, and the Gen 4 did not yellow as much as the others. So it looks to be a good product all the way around. I was just doing this to see how I could work with it on something that wasn't important, and it would be easy to work with, I'm sure. Now let's take a look at how these colors turned out. Across the very top of this image is the actual spools of thread. The first three are photographs that were taken with a flash. The bottom three are photographs that were taken without a flash. The three examples on the bottom without the flash look the closest to what I see with the naked eye, although what I actually see in person under good lighting is closer to the bottom three. But the reality is that what I actually see is somewhere in between the two, but closer to what you see on the bottom, if that makes any sense. It's not quite as dull as what you see on the bottom here, but it's not near as vibrant as what you see on the top either. If you get it out in direct sunlight, the reality of what you're looking at is somewhere in between the two, but closer to the bottom three. I hope that makes sense to you. Some of the things I just wanted to point out, really all the blacks look good. That's the color on the far left, and you can see the spool on top was actually black. Then we got white, then a dark blue, a red, yellow, gray, kind of a neon green or a lime green, a dark purple, an orange, a really light blue, a light purple, and a dark brown. So all the blacks look black to the eye. None of them look bad at all. The white is really interesting to me. The white with the silver underneath looks awesome. It looks really good. It looks very vibrant, just a little bit of a sparkle to it because the metallic showing through on the silver. But if you start looking at the white with the yellow gold underneath it, it has a yellowish tint to it, which you'd kind of expect because white goes more translucent than any other color. That's a neat effect. It kind of gives it a tan or a khaki look to it. And then the copper underneath at the very bottom, the white has almost a rose gold look to it, and it's a really neat effect also. The dark blue looks pretty similar throughout all three colors. The red looks a little different. I think it looks best with the silver, but if you look at the very bottom on the copper, it gets kind of a maroon color, and it really looks like that. It has more of a maroon look to it than it does with the silver underneath in person. And I thought the yellow was really interesting also. The yellow with the copper under it really has a gold look to it. The silver one was another one that's It's similar to white. It's called silver. It's a gray color on the spool, as you can see near the middle there at the very top. On that little sliver up there, you can barely see the spool. The gray has a neat effect to me with the gold underneath it. For some reason, that silver and gold looks good together. That silverish gray looking color. I also thought it looked really good with the copper underneath. I thought it looked good on all three, but the truest color to the spool, of course, was with the silver metallic underneath. The lime green looks good throughout. It is definitely darker with the copper underneath it. The dark purple looked really similar throughout all three metallics underneath. The orange is pretty vibrant looking with the silver underneath, and it kind of gets more muted the darker the metallic underneath goes. The very light blue looks a whole lot darker to me with the copper underneath it than it does with the silver. And then, of course, the yellow gold underneath is somewhere in between the two. The light purple looks almost identical to what it does on the spool with the silver underneath. And the dark brown looks very similar to me on all three. You get some pretty neat color changes. One thing I would like to note is if you look at these colors in person, the copper metallic underneath makes the whole color range look to me a lot more like a vintage rod would look that would have a varnish on it instead of epoxy. It kind of gives the overall feel of most of the colors a more mellow tone. The yellow gold underneath is somewhere in between the silver and the copper, and then the silver is the closest to matching the thread spool color on all the colors. So that's a pretty neat tool to have at your disposal there. If you want a color that's slightly different, experiment with some different metallics underneath, because there's all sorts of metallic colors. There's everything from black to red to silver to gold to copper. There's green metallics, there's blue metallics, there's all different kinds of metallic thread that you can get that you could probably produce some really interesting effects. I only used these three because that's what I had on hand. It would be fun to play around with a black metallic just to see what the different colors would do. And you can see what I was talking about, how my epoxy is not level at all. That was not even a thought in my mind, was trying to get it level. I was more experimenting with the epoxy since that was the first time I'd used it, just to see what I could get away with. And you can see under the flash photos at the top, you can see some of those micro bubbles where I overheated certain areas. I really overheated the whole thing, but it shows up more on the darker colors, those little micro bubbles, and it didn't seem to produce them in some areas, and in some areas it did. But anytime you're experimenting or you're doing something like I was doing here where it's really not important, just play around with different stuff to see what happens. Play around with your color combinations, play around with your epoxies. You can learn a lot by messing stuff up. In fact, I think you learn more from your mistakes than you do your successes. That's what I always tell my kids. I mean, it's true with anything. Although I didn't make any unintentional mistakes here, I was seeing what would happen if I did. That way I'd know. But I just always recommend people try different things just to see what happens. And you can either mess something up and learn from it, or you might figure something out you hadn't thought of before that works well. But I just wanted to go over a little bit about my experience with the Gen 4 for the first time and show you some of the possibilities you can come up with the candy apple effect wraps. It's a good alternative to using color protectant, in my opinion, and you can get some nice vibrant colors, and it doesn't darken as much. If you use the silver, it doesn't darken your thread as much as using a color protectant would. And you can get some cool translucent effects too with your underlying colors. I thought y'all might be interested in seeing some of this stuff, and I just posted the video up. The opportunity hadn't really presented itself here lately for me to do much on videos, and I thought I'd just take this opportunity to talk to y'all for a little bit. If you found any of this useful and you're not a subscriber already, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. It helps me out, and it helps me out with YouTube. I always really appreciate when people do that. That's all I've got for now. I will talk to y'all later.